when most of the country was shutting down in mid-March, and we quickly came to realize within a few weeks after that that most places around the country would not be having their typical spring sports. Then we realized that there was going to be quite a unique circumstance when schools and kids start participating again in conditioning sessions in, anywhere from mid-June to mid-July, everyone getting back to activity again. We were going to be faced with a circumstance that probably had never happened before, where kids were going to have 3 to 4 months straight of no organized sport activity and then return to sport, and going to be returning at probably the worst time they could be from a heat safety perspective, right? They're going to be returning somewhere from mid-June to mid-July, not having exercised formally in a group for upwards of 3 to 4 months. So we were really worried about the potential variability in the fitness status and potential health consequences of these athletes as they return to sport. So we had reached out to the NFHS, which is the national governing body for high school sport in America, and the NCAA, and they both fully supported the idea of doing something like this. And the middle of April, I reached out to my second in charge at KSI, Becca, to lead up this effort, and I'll hand it off to her to describe how it unfolded and how they amazingly got this done in the span of 6 weeks.
The main topics that we focused on, certainly there's a lot of topics that we could have gone into, but the main topics that we did focus on for the document were pre-participation evaluations. It's one of the main ways to identify risk before an athlete even returns to the field. So we felt that that was very important. Return to physical activity and conditioning programs. So addressing how to gradually phase in conditioning and physical activity. And then we also talked about heat acclimatization. And within heat acclimatization, we talked specifically about the acclimatization process and how to also monitor the weather and the environment and modify exercise sessions based on the environment. So that was also one of the standalone sections that we have within the document. And then we also just rounded it out by addressing injury prevention and education-related items for how to disseminate all of this information to the relevant. We were really focused on creating a document that was targeting the high school and collegiate programs because of obviously the increased risk that we're anticipating upon the return to athletics. So we really wanted this to serve as a resource to help those organizations as they're creating their policies and their return programs to help make sure that they're doing it in a safe way. So the great thing is that you said the NFHS, the National Federation for State High School Associations, and the National Strength and Conditioning Association, NSCA, were two of the endorsing agencies, but we also got 6 other major sports medicine organizations to endorse the document. So it's also endorsed by the American College of Sports Medicine, the Collegiate Strength and Conditioning Coaches Association, the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, the National Athletic Trainers Association, and lastly, the National Center for Catastrophic Sport Injury Research. So it was amazing that we were able to get all of those entities on board and endorse the document that we created. And all the resources and the document itself is freely open and accessible on our website. And it comes along with some assisting infographics and also a policy template that high schools and colleges can use to implement the guidelines that are in the document itself. So we tried to make it as openly accessible and easily applicable for all the organizations that could potentially benefit from it. We have a shortened season and this really eager desire to get back to sport, which is great, but we need to temper that with the health and safety associated with the return of athletes to sport, and realizing that some of them may not have any exposure to heat before they get back, and some of them may have been able to exercise and actually might be acclimatized. So you're really, dealing with a very diverse population, and their acclimatization status may be very different, and their heat tolerance may be very different too.
What's happening right now, most of these players, like if you just say the football players that are going to come back in mid-June to mid-July, normally they would have likely been on the baseball team or on the track team or on the lacrosse team or on some other sport in the springtime, or they might have just been involved with the spring conditioning for football, where athletes just get together and do conditioning and weightlifting. And there's usually never more than a week or two that these athletes aren't in some kind of formal, structured athletic activity where they're doing some kind of either conditioning or formal practices in another sport. And then, of course, you also have spring football in most of the states in America where you have a a few weeks of practices, more formal practices, in addition to conditioning sessions. So I just think that the warning really for the coaches, the sport coaches and the strength and conditioning coaches and the athletic directors, and certainly for the awareness for the athletic trainers, is that the variability will be more than anyone has ever seen before with the athletes coming back, because you're going to have some athletes who've done absolutely nothing for 4 months. So you can imagine the amount of deconditioning that's taken place. And then you're going to have some athletes who did a ton because they had more time than they've ever had in their whole life. And they just did a lot of conditioning. And then obviously you're going to have a great range of people that lie between those two ends of the spectrum. And it's with that in mind when they return, if you have coaches who kind of belittle or bully or antagonize athletes who are perceived to have not done as much conditioning or not as good a shape, they're going to obviously run into problems. And really recommend the concept of individuality, where, you know, looking at each individual as their own person and setting up their own fitness programs, especially in the first couple of weeks. Because you got to think of three different things as they return. One is you're going to have the great variability, like I mentioned before, just because of the circumstances. Second, you're going to have some athletes who had COVID-19 and who are recovered from it, but they might be long-term complications from it that we just don't fully understand yet, maybe cardiovascularly, pulmonary, and others. And then third, the reality is we're going to have some athletes who have COVID-19 on the practice field, because that's just going to happen when you have 300 or 400 athletes returning for men and women's soccer and field hockey and volleyball and cross country and football. And you're going to have a couple, and those ones who are actively fighting it are going to really be struggling, especially if they're not aware that they have it. So people just have to be super aware, very flexible to different possibilities, and not expect times that people have hit in the past, or certain repetitions or sets or weights that they hit in the weight room or times they hit on the track. Don't expect what people have done in previous years of your coaching for the same things to apply this year, and to really use the first 2 to 3 weeks to try to move people in the direction that you ultimately want them to get to. But it's going to happen at a different pace for each of the different athletes. So I think that's just kind of a little bit of a background for people to understand, and then we can do more in depth related to obviously the heat acclimatization, WBGT, which, you know, are really two different issues. So people who come from lower socioeconomic status were probably much less likely to afford like personal trainers during this time, one-on-one teaching, proper maybe fitness facilities in their house. They also probably had to also step up and do more things for their family, because their families very likely were more likely to lose their jobs, and they probably had to assist with other siblings in the house. Remember, those schools are also much less likely to have athletic trainers, because as we know from the work we've done at KSI, that the lower socioeconomic status schools are much less likely to have the athletic training services at their school. So that that healthcare discrepancy, you know, definitely impacts, you know, the situation that we're facing right now, that people coming from tougher situations, I think it's going to be amplified when they return to sport.
We tried to focus on those topic areas that I mentioned previously in the document. There's a lot of other great resources that we link to in the document that really talk on specifics of like the personal protective equipment that should be worn, and also like the cleaning procedures that are involved with return to athletics. So obviously there's going to be some enhanced measures and precautions in place that should be followed, that I think everybody's pretty familiar with at this point, in terms of, you know, wearing the face masks and making sure everybody's washing their hands. One of the big things that we did mention in the document is that if possible, we highly recommend that individual water bottles and water sources are used, because certainly we don't want athletes sharing bottles, because that could be an easy way to transmit a virus. So we highly recommended that you know, individual water bottles are used at practices. But yeah, a lot of the details in terms of personal protective equipment and cleaning procedures have been released by some of the other major organizations. And those are all linked to in the document, as well as like a resource list that we have on the website that's linked with the publication.
We also want to respect every state has different specific guidelines, and we didn't want to specifically say one thing, and that might be usurped by whatever phase each particular state is in at a particular time for guidelines that they should be following. The cool thing about this is really a great opportunity to work with the NFHS on this document. You know, as Becca mentioned, they're one of the endorsing agencies. but they're the national governing body for high school sport, and they have 51 state high school athletic associations. The 50 states in our country and the District of Columbia each have their own association, and they sent this document out to each of those 51 entities. And it really, I think, served as a critical template for them to use it as a framework to work within their own state guidelines that are being formed by their own governor and their own health divisions, but using it within the context of sport and very specific nuances and issues that you face when you return to sport. I think that's what the document provides. And as Becca mentioned, and important to send people to the KSI website, is that the document itself, if you view it at our website, there's so many hyperlinks to different resources that will also help people and not have to reinvent the wheel at each of the individual 20,000 high schools in America. First of all, I think for anybody who might be watching this program is to kind of remind people, we often have coaches and strength coaches and athletic directors at high schools especially, they kind of lose sight of the difference between heat acclimatization and environmental monitoring. These are two very different things, right? Heat acclimatization is the phasing in of activity over the first couple of weeks of exposure to the heat to allow for the physiological changes to take place in your body to enhance your exercise heat tolerance. And that has to happen for every human being if you really want to optimize exercise heat tolerance as they're working towards, infusing exercise sessions in the heat. And it takes, 7 to 10 days to get maybe 90% of that, and a couple of weeks to get maybe 95% of it. So we have to be super careful. And I think it may be even more careful now than we normally have in the past. That's why I said earlier, 2 to 3 weeks, to really be sensitive to that. But environmental monitoring has to happen every day. So even if you're fully heat acclimatized, and it might be day 24 or day 22, let's say you started on July 1st and August 8th is a really brutally hot day, you have to make modifications. So environmental monitoring happens every single day, because our big interest with environmental monitoring is to make alterations to the work to rest ratio when the environmental conditions are above and beyond what you're normally used to where you live. So the directions would be different if you lived in Maine versus if you lived in Georgia, because normal in Georgia is much warmer than it is in Maine. So you'd have different guidelines. But if it's way warmer than it is for you usually in Georgia, and you're a football team in Athens, Georgia, about to take the practice field, and it's way worse than usual, you need to make modifications to the work to rest ratio. And that's why it's critical that you use the WBGT monitoring, or which is known as wet bulb globe temperature monitoring, because it gives an added level of accuracy for the environmental stress you're going to face. Because there's raw temperature, right, that you hear somebody say on the radio in the morning, oh, it's going to be 95 degrees today. And then heat index infuses an additional item. It gives you humidity. So it might be 95 degrees, but you might be in Phoenix and it might be 5% humidity. So it might not be that big of a deal. But you might be in Gainesville, Florida, and it might be 75% humidity, which that would be a horrible day. And then you have the third element that wet bulb globe temperature brings in, is the effect from the sun and the radiant heat, which is critically important, because if it's a full cloud day in Gainesville, Florida, it might not be that bad. But if it's a full sun day and you're practicing at 3 o'clock on artificial turf fields, that could be 140 degrees, a couple feet off of the surface. Or you're on a black track, that really absorbs the heat. So the WBGT gives us an ability to assess more aspects of the environment to make better predictions on how we should modify the exercise session to best, optimize the chances of keeping the athlete safe. It's not a foolproof method. It helps us. We still obviously always have to be ready for something bad to happen and be ready to treat them. But using the WBGT in conjunction with good heat acclimatization phase-in programs, allows us to have the best opportunity to keep them safe. Certainly TUFS stands for Team Up for Sport Safety. And that's our initiative to visit all 51 states. And we're to try to enhance health and safety standards for high school sport. So we visited 13 states so far, and over the next 3 to 4 years, we'll be visiting all 50 states in the country. And these are our massive efforts to obviously enhance health and safety standards for heat safety, but also cardiovascular stuff, head injuries, coaching education, emergency action plans, athletic training services, strength and conditioning sessions, all those kinds of things. So that's TUFS, and that's exciting because most of the people who'd be watching this, would be in a state that, could be involved with making those changes. Another huge new one is called Innovate, play on words with the AT inside of the word innovate. where we just landed a $3 million grant to place athletic trainers into high schools and inner city schools, especially that have never had athletic training services before. So we're trying to develop a system where local medical hospitals and clinics and stuff would want to partner with us, where we would help get the services in place, but then they would absorb the cost of this after we get it successfully running, so that there'd be long-term sustainability. And again, try to help with some of the healthcare discrepancies in some places that traditionally have been underserved. And then other one, obviously, that many people are aware of is Atlas Athletic Training Location and Services, where our continued effort to keep track of athletic training services at the high school level, where we map every high school in America and try to keep track of who has athletic trainers and who don't, and when they do, the extent of services that are provided. Because as you know, at Kestrel, and you advocate along with KSI, that we want to see an athletic trainer in every high school in America, but we want to have that healthcare professional who can really lead the charge with environmental monitoring and heat acclimatization and heat stroke care and everything related to cardiac and sickling and head injuries and everything else that could potentially be an emergency, during these summer conditioning sessions and throughout the year. We want the athletic trainer there at the high school. So those three efforts of Tufts, Innovate, and Atlas are all really focused on trying to enhance health and safety standards for high school athletes, especially using the athletic trainer as the conduit to deliver those services.